Hi, my name's Rowe, and I'm a novelist. It's what I was put on this earth to do, but it hasn't been easy. I started writing almost accidentally, inspired to tell the story of a Greek myth which, like all Greek myths, existed in a vast collection of interconnected stories told by thousands of people over hundreds of years. What came down to us moderners from those original stories were fragmented pieces of fragmented stories, all jumbled into a mishmash of similar stories with gods and goddesses, heroes and monsters, and themes guiding people toward moral courage, the dangers of hubris, and a mortal's proper place before the gods. Modern storytellers and books tend to tell these stories in neat pieces for the sake of brevity and coherence. A modern telling might have the story of Daedalus and Icarus and the wax wings, or the story of Zeus and Europa. What a modern reader might not ever learn, though, is that these stories are closely connected, that Europa's son was the very king Daedalus and Icarus were fleeing on those wax wings, and also that a lot of interesting things happened in between, some of which you probably already know as other fragments of other Greek myths. I wanted to tell the whole story, connecting all those fragments into something complete, something epic. So I started researching, putting pieces together like a great mythological puzzle without a picture on the box to guide me, connecting similar fragments, grouping family histories, and drawing timelines. When it was finally completed, I had this magnificent story filled with gods, heroes, villains, magical circumstances, and fantastic creatures. But I didn't have a single word on paper. And in my ignorance I thought, why not? Why not give it a go? Let's write the first chapter and see how it turns out. Probably like most novice writers, when I'd finished that first chapter I was just naive enough to think that I'd written something good. So I kept writing. And here I am over 15 years later. Since then I've completed 7 novels and far more short stories and essays. I've earned master's degrees in fiction writing and narrative theory. I've built my own outlet as a self-published author and freelance editor. I've taught fiction writing and composition at the college level, worked on the staff of a literary magazine, and presented my theoretical scholarship at the International Society for the Study of Narrative. It's been quite the journey. My goal here is to share the most important parts of my journey with you, the knowledge and the lessons I've acquired during that long trek, and hopefully that'll save you a lot of trouble and time that, quite frankly, you don't need to waste. A huge portion of the process of becoming a good fiction writer is filled with trial and error, mistakes, and more mistakes. And the hope is that somewhere along the way, you learn that you're making a mistake, and you learn how to fix that mistake, and you learn how to stop making that mistake again in the future. Most people who teach fiction writing think this is just the process because that's what they had to do after all. But I think that's simply not good enough. I've already fallen into most of the pits, and I've been observant enough to learn why. So why should you have to fall in a pit? I'm more than happy to clearly mark the big ones so you can avoid them. That's my goal when I'm teaching, to save you time and trouble and hopefully make the next generation of fiction writers better than the one that came before it. That'd be nice. So here goes. The following series of materials is a set of lessons I've collectively titled The Mechanics of Fiction Writing. It's a different approach to teaching fiction writing than anything else out there, and believe me, I've read hundreds of books on how to write fiction. From English professors to magazine writers, to the top literary writers, to the top-selling authors in history, to publishers and editors, you name it, I've read it. And I'm not presenting this material to cut down anyone else's approach, because I've learned a ton from all of them. But most of them, at their very best, have some of the pieces you need. Fragments, you might say, much like the Greek mythology. What I've put together here in these lessons is the picture on the box. A system for understanding the big picture that will make every fiction writer better, from a novice who's never taken a class to a successful published author. Fittingly, I'm going to begin with a story. Picture this. I just packed my entire life into a car, left behind all my family and friends, and moved all the way across the country to a place I knew nothing about. And all because I had the opportunity to spend the next 3 years of my life focusing on fiction writing. I'd been accepted to a prestigious MFA program, and I was going to get to study my craft with some of the great fiction writers in the country, full time. Oh man, was I ecstatic. Thing was, I had no idea what to expect. No idea. I'd never taken a writing class in my life. I was as self-taught as they come, writing, in my spare time between my various shift jobs. And when I wasn't actively working on a writing project, I was reading books on grammar and listening to lectures on syntax and sentence writing. I was so happy to be studying with the experts finally. I thought for sure they'd be able to help me fill in all the pieces my writing was missing. Here's what I expected when I walked into my first MFA fiction workshop. MFA equals Master of Fine Arts. I thought of art as a decent metaphor for what a fiction writing class should teach you. Take painting, for example. I don't know how to paint, so a good way to learn would be to sign up for a class, right? And on that first day of class, I'd expect a good painting instructor to offer a brief but fairly comprehensive introduction to the tools of the trade. Here is the canvas. There are many different surfaces painters commonly paint on, and here are the advantages and disadvantages of each. Here is your palette. You hold it like so, and you choose the colors for it as such so that you can mix the colors easily as needed. Here are your brushes. This one is good for this technique, which you would commonly use in a landscape. This one is better for fine detail work if you are painting portraits, etc. I was hoping for something like that in my MFA program, and boy was I greatly mistaken. That expectation could not have been any farther away from what workshops are actually like. Basically, a writing workshop involves a bunch of writers who are theoretically at about the same skill level, though almost never in reality. This group of writers reads your work and critiques it. Each writer in the group tries to offer useful feedback based on their individual reading of the story, filtered through their general understanding of how fiction writing works, and colored by their vague impression of what your writing might be trying to accomplish. At the head of a workshop is a more experienced writer, ideally a successful published author with accolades and the like. She or he does their very best to guide the discussion in a direction that they perceive to be fruitful, based on their general understanding of how fiction writing works, and their guess as to where you're trying to go with the piece you've presented to the group. Often it's a lot like 10 blindfolded people throwing hundreds of darts at a moving dartboard for half an hour. There are bound to be a few darts sticking in the board at the end, and who knows, maybe one of those 10 people hits the bullseye. But there's a hell of a mess of darts all over the floor and sticking in the walls, and maybe someone's even taken an eye out. And through all of this, if you're lucky, rarely, for brief periods of time, the experienced writer might talk about technique a little, but usually in vague, metaphorical terms you need the priestess of the Delphic oracle to help interpret. It's a lot of fun though. Seriously, it is. But the thing is, workshop is far more like a tarot card reading than that first skills-based painting class I described. You take away the few pieces that you think might work, and you discard almost everything else. And through all of it, you probably feel just confused enough that you don't really know whether your writing is getting any better, because you don't. And that's more or less how writing gets taught. That expert writer in the room, she got taught that way, and so did her teacher, and if he was lucky, he even had a teacher. So why isn't a writing class taught like a painting class? There are a few good reasons for it. The first isn't that difficult to imagine. The tools of painting are tangible. You can pick up a brush and ask, how does this one work, and what's it good for? And a teacher can demonstrate the way you should hold it in your hand, the movements you should make, and the way the bristles should curve against the canvas as you're working on a specific aspect of a painting. The tools of writing are abstract. You can't hold grammar and syntax in your hand, and you have to think to even realize how and when you're applying them, or even that you're applying them at all. That's a significant difference. You can work on improving these skills, but it isn't self-evident that they're markedly improving unless you start from a place where they're really bad to begin with. And don't worry, this isn't going to turn into a grammar lesson. I'm just using it as an illustration. The second reason is that writing fiction is a more complex business than painting. I don't mean to belittle painting in any way. It's an incredible skill, and Lord knows I can't do it, but it just is. Writing is one of the most cognitively complex artistic endeavors a human being can attempt. I'll show you why. Take the following sentence. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. That's the second sentence in Herman Melville's masterpiece, Moby Dick. Now check out this sentence. Having little or no money in my purse some years ago, never mind how long precisely, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. Now this one. Never mind how long precisely, some years ago, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world, having little or no money in my purse and nothing particular to interest me on shore. I've changed 0 of the 40 words in that sentence, and for brevity's sake, I've only included 2 of the myriad ways I could have rewritten that sentence using the exact same words. It changes the sentence. It still contains the same basic propositions, and largely the meaning remains the same. But there's a reason Melville wrote that sentence the way he did, and not the 2 ways I rewrote it. I've only changed this one sentence in Moby Dick along one dimension, syntax, the order the words and phrases appear in the sentence. Now imagine how many ways I could change that sentence if I started to change the same sentence by using different words. Linguists would call this dimension paradigmatic, in case you were interested. A ways back, don't sweat the details, out of dough and bored to death with the neighborhood, I figured I'd hop aboard a ship and check out the ocean for a change. Or, if I changed paradigm and syntax. I went whaling once, amigo. No need to worry about the details, but it was a while ago when I was out of scratch and dead tired with the solid earth. Now, all I've done is change this one sentence in a novel with thousands upon thousands of sentences, and I've only messed with this sentence on 2 dimensions, word choice and word order. To the extent that I could, I didn't even attempt to change the meaning. I have though, haven't I? Even if it's just a little. And all of the changes that I made are products of cognitive choices that happened when I decided to put down one word instead of another, just the same as Melville did over 150 years ago. He had an infinite number of ways he could have crafted Moby Dick that weren't an eternal literary masterpiece. But he ended up choosing the right one. How did he do that? Well, there's not a single easy answer for that, unfortunately. But I can give you a vague picture based on the example above, and this gets to the heart of why teaching and learning fiction writing are both necessarily vague arts. Here's another sentence from Moby Dick, arguably the most famous one, and not even the shortest if you can believe it. Call me Ishmael. Now, we already know there's an infinite number of ways we could change the words and meaning in that sentence if we decide to change syntax, paradigm, and the number of words we decide to use. I'm Ishmael, friends. My name's Ishmael, but you can call me Izzy if you like, given that I prefer nicknames and tend to give everyone else I know a nickname the second I meet them. Ishmael's the name, whalin's the game. Okay, been there, done that. Fair enough. Now, watch this. There once was a man from Nantucket, whose name was Ishmael Puckett. Game changer. Did you catch that? Suddenly, Ishmael's not the only one here. The words are coming from someplace else. But where? We've just irrevocably altered Moby Dick across a whole other dimension by changing the narrator. Ishmael is no longer the speaker. In these lessons, I'm going to outline the 6 major dimensions a writer needs to understand. And don't worry, I'm going to keep it simple. Of these 6 dimensions, there is only one you can make a case for having a finite number of choices. I only mention the complexity to explain why the teaching of fiction writing has always been almost strictly trial and error. Basically, you're dealing with 6 dimensions of infinity, and all of them deal with abstract concepts like word choice, word order, the narrator's orientation to the story, and we haven't even begun to talk about the most complex dimension of all, the events that actually happen in the story. Head spinning? Don't worry, there's a lot to learn. But if we take each thing one step at a time and talk in simple terms, you'll have a better understanding of how fiction works than you could hope to get from the finest MFA programs, because I'm going to approach this in the way that no one else does. I'm going to articulate each of the components of fiction just like the painting instructor in that first class. Here are your tools, here's how they function, here's how great writers have used these tools successfully in a story before, here's how you can poach those moves. Here's how to know when to use which tool. That's what these lessons are about. We're going to get there, Just bear with me a little bit longer on the groundwork and we'll be on to the good stuff. Promise. So I had this professor in my MFA program. Call her Kim. Her name actually is Kim. Amazing writer. Consistently one of the greatest according to a little organization that gives prizes, by the name of Pulitzer if we're being specific. And when Kim sits down to write a book, she has the same blank screen as we all do. It's the same as the blank piece of paper Melville and countless others had before word processors. Kim has the same 6 dimensions of infinity from which to choose, and by her account, she just starts with a single idea and a keyboard, and she writes. And she keeps writing. And wherever the story takes her, that's where she lets it go. Doesn't outline, doesn't plan in advance, doesn't direct the action in any conscious way. She just lets the story do the talking, so to speak. And she waits to find out what happens in the end, same as her reader. This, I would say, is how most literary fiction writers work. It's a very common process. It involves a lot of spontaneity and intuition on the front end, and it involves a deep commitment to revision and rewriting on the back end, because no one just sits down and writes a masterpiece, or even an excellent draft on the first pass. Now take David. He's a pretty good writer too. He wrote a big old masterpiece of his own titled Infinite Jest. Lots of the very best literary writers and critics think David's one of the best writers of the last 100 years, and they're probably not wrong in thinking people will still be reading his work for a long time to come. Check out this passage from a story in Esquire that he wrote some years back. 2a. Meanwhile, FL is answering J's orage question in vehement neg. Tears appearing in eye. Holy shit, no. God, no, no, never. Had loved her always. Was never as fully there as when he and J were making love. If in J's POV, insert together after love. 2a. 1. At emotional height of dialogue, tears streaming down half face, FL confesses, declares that he still loves J, has all this time, 5 years in fact, sometimes still thinks of J while making love to his current fiancée, which causes him to feel guilty. That's a snippet from a story titled Adult World 2, and as you can probably tell, this story is written as if it were a set of notes that an author would scribble while planning to write a story. The irony David intended to convey with this story is that the set of details is so precise you don't really need to write the story. You might interpret it as either a cynical slap at how mechanical contemporary fiction might be, or perhaps it was a straight critique of the method of such writers who do plan so methodically. Or perhaps he was too depressed, as he so tragically was, to be bothered to write the story for real. Only David knew. For our purposes, though, this passage illustrates a contrast, the yang to Kim's yin. These two approaches represent the extremes of how different writers approach fiction writing. The freewheeling, intuitive, let the story come as it may Kims of the writing world, and the hyper-prepared, over-outlined, plan every last detail Davids. The reason I've drawn this contrast is to illustrate the third reason why there isn't already a series of lessons like this out there. Most writers are Kims. There's a good reason for this. Think of the stereotype of a poet. Does she have a clean car? Iron wrinkles out of her jeans? No, thought not. It's far more likely she's running around trying to remember where she left the keys to said messy car. Hint to the poet, they're in the pocket of your wrinkled jeans, hunched up in a ball beside the laundry basket. Dirty clothes go in the basket, by the way. In personality psychology, the dimension of openness is tightly tied to creativity. Artists and other creative people don't tend to systematize things. It's why that poet can't be bothered to put her dirty jeans in the laundry basket. Close is close enough. And it's also why someone else hasn't come along to write a series on the mechanics of fiction writing yet. It would take someone who would look at a problem with infinite complexity and think, how can I develop a system to account for an infinite possibility of choices across 6 different dimensions and develop it into a guide for practical application? That's just not how Kims work. Most Davids, on the other hand, thankfully, care far more about engineering bridges that don't collapse in a hurricane and building voice recognition software that can hear the difference between will go and dildo even when the speaker has a Spanish accent. And do we ever need both Kims and Davids in this world? Personality-wise, I tend more toward being a Kim than a David, but I was trained to systematize by a former NASA engineer when I was working in another field. For a writer, though, when I approach one of my own projects, I'm likely closer to the David end of the spectrum than the average writer, but I've never written anything close to the excerpt from David's story that I shared above. So what's this all about, the planning versus intuition discussion? I'm mentioning all of this because if you're like most writers, it's hard for you to be bothered to listen to a series of lectures about writing. You'd much rather spend your precious time writing. And I get that fact. In fact, I used to say something like that all the time. If I've got a choice between reading and writing, I'm going to write 9 times out of 10 and 10 times on Sunday. It's a very Kim thing to say. I'll just keep writing and revising until I know the book is finished. And I'll know when I know. Fair enough. I know I don't need to convince the Davids here of this approach's value. I had them at the mechanics of fiction writing. But I'm going to make a serious case to the Kims still hanging in there. Moby Dick has almost 250,000 words in it. Multiply that by the number of choices in syntax and paradigm. Then multiply that by the number of possibilities for the events in each chapter, the setting for each scene, the thematic conceits and the subtext. Melville had to have made at least 100 million narrative decisions during the year he was writing Moby Dick. And what that means is that most of those decisions were not conscious choices. One simply cannot make that many conscious decisions in a year. Most of what writers do when they write, they don't know about. Even the most meticulous planner still will only ever touch a fraction of the choices they make on a conscious level. I'm not advocating for anyone to be less intuitive. It all still has to come from that same mysterious place that gave us Bach, Da Vinci, and Emily Dickinson. What learning the mechanics of fiction can do is offer you an understanding of the big decisions, because if you're going to make 100 million decisions, some of them are going to be bad ones, and if you make the wrong decision on any of the big decisions, you're going to be revising your novel for the next 5 years without a real clue if you're going in the right direction. These lessons will help you to tell the good decisions from the bad decisions for your work. It will clearly outline the tools you need to understand how to use and how to apply each for the desired effect you're looking to create in your fiction. And if you're a beginner and don't know yet, it's going to help you to learn how to start making those choices. But more importantly, why one choice is right for one story when a very different choice would be right for another. Additionally, these lessons will give you a much sharper vocabulary for discussing both your work and the fiction of other writers. This is something that the trial and error approach is seriously lacking. Anyone who has ever been in a workshop can attest that most of the conversations in them go something like, "Random dude in workshop. I don't really know if I'm on board with the whole tone of the narration. I mean, I like the overall style, but it's just, something about the narration rubbed me the wrong way." Me to myself, I wonder what the hell this guy thinks he means when he uses the words tone and style. What on earth does he even think he's trying to say? The truth? He probably doesn't know. As demonstrated above, this stuff is incredibly complex. Articulating it properly is even harder. Having a useful name for all the tools you'll need in your writer's toolbox will help you not only to understand your work, but that of your fellow writers. And it will help you learn the moves of your favorite writers. Figure out exactly what they're doing, and make those moves yourself. I'm going to try and avoid being so broadly metaphorical as to be cryptic. Remember the painting class. Here are your tools. Here's how you use them. So where am I getting all this useful information, you might be inclined to ask? I am a compiler. Most of these lessons are adapted from lessons I've learned and not created. I've turned over every stone I can think to lift in order to understand how fiction works. That's a lot of stones, and there are fragments of useful information under many of them. Primarily I'm drawing from 4 areas of study: narrative craft, narrative theory, cognitive and evolutionary psychology, and linguistics and semiotics. If you don't know what all those fields are in any real sense, that's fine. I'll give a brief overview. Craft guides. You've probably seen a book like this if you've taken a fiction writing class or looked for a how-to guide for writing fiction at the bookstore. They range from pretty good to god-awful. There's a fair amount of useful information in a good one, but it's usually jumbled a bit. They often speak in broad metaphorical terms that will please Kims and drive Davids crazy. and sometimes they get major pieces wrong. They derive much of their authority from quoting great writers on their writing process, or on their musings about certain aspects of the craft. This can be both good and bad. Given that most of the decisions writers make are necessarily subconscious, most writers only think they know what they're doing. Often they'll lead you in the right direction, but just as often they'll only speak in vague metaphorical terms or give advice that's great in some circumstances and flat out wrong in others. Just because someone has intuitively learned to do something at a high level doesn't mean they can teach you to do it. Go take a ski lesson and you'll find that out real fast. Narrative theory. This is an academic field of study that uses an empirical approach to explore stories and their component elements. Narrative theorists study texts in great detail in order to understand the different aspects of narrative. A good example of this is the distinction between a character narrator in the story like Ishmael and a disembodied narrator outside the story, the sort of godlike voice that many novels use. Narrative theorists make these and hundreds of other useful distinctions when studying stories. The problem with them is that they're a bunch of geeks who like to make up words like focalization, metadiegetic, and paralipsis. They also tend to be terrible writers who are overly in love with their own words and intellect. So it's not always fun wading through thousands of pages of their scholarship to pull out the little nuggets of useful information that can help make you a better writer. Fortunately, somebody's already done that for you. Rowe takes facetious bow. Cognitive and evolutionary psychology. I'm not the only narrative theorist to make the connection between the cognitive process of storytelling and the necessity to understand the human brain. In fact, there's a whole subfield that really wonky professor types call cognitive narratology. These are people trying to decode the links between storytelling and cognition. They include linguists, psychologists, neurologists, narratologists, and a whole bunch of other scholars and researchers with fancy titles. The bottom line is that a story happens in the brain, and knowing how that happens will make you a much more powerful writer. And you don't even need to take a course in neuroanatomy. I've already done that for you, and I'm happy to translate. Rowe takes slightly less facetious bow. Linguistics and semiotics. These fields study how language functions to symbolically represent real-world objects and ideas, as well as how those linguistic representations vary from language to language. We probably won't get too deep into the weeds here, but it's useful to consider that as a writer, words are your ultimate tools, the specific delivery mode for your ideas. You could consider words a lot like the way a doctor considers the cells composing a patient's body. They're the base particles that give rise to a functioning story. The lessons here are more about the big picture than the small, but it bears mentioning that a considerable amount of thought about the smallest units went into bringing you a clearer view of the big picture. And speaking of the big picture, congratulations, we're almost there. We are about to begin to explore the 6 major compartments in the writer's toolbox, your abstract brushes, if you will. They're probably going to sound familiar. They are the plot, the narrator, the characters, the story world, the text, and the subtext. These are the 6 dimensions of fiction we'll cover in detail. By the end of these lessons, you'll know them inside and out and have a thorough understanding of how each one shapes a story. Each of these dimensions, as we've already discovered, is incredibly complex. We'll cover how you can use each aspect of these dimensions to tell the precise story you want to tell in the most effective way possible. You'll learn which tools work best for which types of stories and why. And we'll try to do it without getting away from the purpose of this whole exercise, how you can write a better story. On this front, I would be remiss if I failed to mention the following about your tools. All of the dimensions of written fiction are critical. You may hear some very smart writers say things like, literary fiction is all about characters. And there is some truth to that statement. But it's more useful to consider each of these 6 categories in the same way a doctor would think about the systems of the body. A doctor who has a patient with a bad cardiovascular system is rightly worried for that patient. Never mind that the nervous system and the musculature are pristine. The fate of a story conceived with only character is as dead as the brain without a heartbeat. You'll find many such stories taking their final breaths in the slush piles of literary magazines. soon to be sent to the literary world's mortuary with the word rejected stamped on the toe tag. These 6 dimensions function together in a living work of fiction. They are interdependent and all must be attended to. But before we do that, there's one final pressing piece of business before we start to talk about plot.